In-flight emergencies, fire. So our agenda for today is going to be defining this particular type of in-flight emergency, the in-flight action necessary, as well as the post-flight action for an in-flight fire, and lastly, a summary of what course of action we should take for these types of emergencies in preparation for them, hopefully never having to use them, but always being prepared and being proactive in our approach to these types of scenarios. So firstly, a definition. An in-flight fire is a fire which occurs while an aircraft is airborne. It's pretty self-explanatory, but very important to note that this is whilst an aircraft is airborne. We can have fires while we are still on the ground, which are a lot more favorable in terms of, first and foremost, the practicality of it being that we are already on the ground. So we are 9 times out of 10 in a place where we can have safety personnel or other people to come aid us with the present scenario. Whereas an airborne in-flight fire causes a litany of other external pressures and factors that a pilot has to take into consideration for not just the fire itself, but also a prompt and quick landing shortly thereafter. So how does it affect me or us as pilots? In-flight fires are one of the most intense and difficult in-flight emergencies that we can encounter, and particularly in the field of general aviation, where oftentimes we find that there is only a singular pilot in the aircraft. It is paramount to be able to deal with these situations in as quickly a fashion as possible and to be familiarized with the steps necessary to take corrective action. Depending on the severity and the type of fire that we are dealing with, however, this corrective action will be different. So that is the first step. What are we dealing with? In-flight fires tend to generally fall into one of two camps, and that is either an engine fire and an electrical fire. The difference being here primarily is the fuel source or the start by which the fire commences. On the left-hand side, for engine fires, it could be a litany of things, but amongst them being a very, very hot surface combined with a leaking fuel line or a leaking oil line. 9 times out of 10, this will be present in the form of black smoke billowing from our engine bay, a rough running engine, or also prior to a drop in fuel or oil pressure, which are potential signs that we should be looking out for. On the other hand, an electrical fire will, as its name implies, start by either a loose, frayed, or otherwise cut or open wire coming into contact with, once again, any sort of fuel source, be it fuel itself, oil, or any sort of combustible material, such as the insulation that goes around some parts of our engine bay and instrumentation. In either of these cases, the first course of action should always be to cut off the fuel source for the fire. In the case of an engine fire, we want to cut off the fuel and lean the mixture, as that is very important to doing so. And in the case of an electrical fire, we want to turn off the electrical components, in this case our battery and the alternator. So herein lies our timeline for our corrective action. The first step being detection, the one we've already talked about, determining the source and the nature of the fire. Second of all, checklist usage is imperative and paramount. For these types of scenarios, we specifically have emergency checklists. In the case of an engine fire and in-flight, at the top of which we find cut off for mixture, fuel shut off, and shut off for our fuel pump as well as our master. This is making sure that we are starving the fire of its primary source of power, that being either the fuel, oil, or the electrical source. Thirdly, we want to open doors, use flaps as necessary, and increase our airspeed to not only starve the fire of its fuel source or power, but also starve it of the other component that is helping it, which is air. There are two fields of thought in this scenario, one of them being that increasing the airspeed or initiating that emergency descent might be detrimental as it introduces more air into the cabin or into the aircraft, which could help the fire rather than aid us. The other one being that it will help to starve it, but will also serve a secondary purpose, which would be to clear out any smoke that we might have in the cabin. This is why opening doors and using the flaps is necessary as well to be able to move and change the airflow around the aircraft is also imperative. This is one of the things that aren't on the checklist but is very important to highlight, as every single scenario might be a little bit different, and it is important to use our other resources as necessary to be able to deal with the problem at hand. Fourth, we want to initiate an emergency descent to the nearest field. An engine fire will 9 times out of 10 be something that necessitates a landing at the closest possible space possible, as practically as possible. And so we want to initiate that descent wherever that may be. If it's not an ideal situation and we're not in the vicinity of an airport, that will unfortunately mean that we will be landing in the closest field possible. Lastly, and most importantly, we want to declare an emergency so that we can get emergency services and safety personnel to the aircraft as soon as practicable and prepare the cabin for landing. We want to make sure that any sharp or loose items are secured, that our passengers have been briefed, that we have let them know of our emergency exits, that we have prepared the cabin as much as we can so that we may be able to exit that aircraft as promptly as possible as soon as we perform the landing. So in summary, armed with the right tools and preparation, pilots from all parts of the aviation industry can be prepared to tackle on these extreme emergencies, such as it is. Proper decision making, checklist usage, and training is also very paramount to mitigating these emergencies and keep them from becoming catastrophes. On the top left-hand side, we have the case of Red Air, a 135 operator that in June of 2022 had to do an emergency landing in Miami. Although this fire wasn't an in-flight fire per se, we can see the results of proper training, decision-making, and checklist usage. In this case, they had to do a forced landing because their landing gear was inoperative. Eventually, one of their engines caught on fire, but we can see the resulting actions on behalf of the pilots ended up in a scenario that could have gotten much worse. Fortunately for everyone on board that flight, there were no casualties. On the bottom left-hand side, we see a general aviation accident that happened in Gainesville, and this picture illustrates the necessity and the imperativeness of leaving the aircraft once the landing has been performed, as these, particularly in this case, these light aircraft are not designed to be able to take on such stresses, and so the fuel on board will most likely than not aid in that fire billowing out and creating a more hazardous situation for everyone that was on board that airplane. But once more, we see that the resulting action on behalf of the pilot got him to not only a favorable field, but also in a position to be able to leave the aircraft as promptly as possible. On the top right, we see Tibet Airlines, which once again illustrates the importance and that last step of declaring an emergency, that all the safety personnel and everyone that was able to get to the aircraft as promptly as it did was only able to do so because of the pilot letting ATC aware of the situation at hand. So once more, to reiterate, proper aeronautical decision making, checklist usage, and training are all paramount to helping us in preparing for these types of emergencies, as rare as they may be. A pilot that is prepared is a pilot that can help in any of these situations.